Welcome to Washington Policy on the Go. My name is Donald Kimball. I am the Communications Manager at Washington Policy Center. Thanks so much for joining us live for this event. As I'm sure you are all aware, we are in the midst of a legislative session. We are still in the early stages, and there are lots of bills coming through. And so today we're going to be talking about a couple of those, as well as a rule change. Before we get into that, if you're watching this after the fact on YouTube, make sure to like and subscribe. It really helps us get our message out there. We really appreciate the growth we've been seeing. So if this information is useful to you, just leaving a like does us a lot of help. And make sure to share it with anyone that you think could benefit as well. If you're watching this live, we do have the questions and answers portal. So make sure to submit any questions you have in that portal. So with that being said, we're going to welcome on Mark Harmsworth, our small business director. Thanks so much for being with us, Mark. You've got a bunch of blogs up because a bunch of stuff has been happening in this legislative session. We're going to start with the good, and then we'll move on to maybe the bad and the ugly. So the first thing, well, the most recent thing you've written about here is a rules change from the House of Representatives that would abolish title-only bills. Do you want to just give a little bit of background about what that is and just what this change means?
Yeah, thanks for having me on today, Donald. It's always fun to be on the go. So the over the last few decades, in fact, they've had this concept of a title-only bill. And typically what happens with bills is some legislator will work with staff, they write a bill, and you get a bill title, you get what's called a preamble, so it sort of describes why they're doing the bill. And then they have the nuts and the bolts, what they're going to change, if they're going to add new law, and so on. And that bill gets dropped. And then there's a whole process that you go through where folks can come in and testify saying this is a good idea or it's a bad idea. And then they take votes in committee and so on. So that whole process is set up somewhat to slow things down, but also that there's good public engagement on these laws that are being proposed and passed. And they had this concept of a title-only bill. And what that enabled the more nefarious folks to do, should I say, is put a bill in because they have deadlines in the legislative schedule that say by this certain date, you have to have all your bills introduced into your house of origin or into committee. And they do these cutoffs so that they're not in legislative session perpetually, which would be the nightmare of the entire state. But they introduce these bills and they don't have the text yet. So typically this happens pretty much every year with the transportation budget or the main budget because they're not done. And you've probably heard this both at the federal level and it happens at the state level where legislators only get 24 hours to read a 1,000-page bill of budget information and all this kind of stuff. And that's what title-only bills happen with. That's what they cause. So a title-only bill can be introduced before the deadline, and then after the deadline, they can use an amendment process to fill in the details. Terrible practice because it doesn't give either the majority or the minority, the time they need to really go through the bills and make sure they're good legislation, they're good policy. So the legislature last Friday put into they have these rules that they pass every year, but there's also a set of permanent rules that they typically don't touch. But this time they did, and they added a section here which says no bill shall be introduced by title only, and in the event a bill is not complete, or at least section 1, that's the preamble, shall be set forth in full before the bill may be accepted for introduction, which basically bans the practice of dropping these title-only bills. Former director here, Jason Mercier, was an advocate for this for many, many years and was pushing hard the legislators to pass this rule and not do this because of the lack of transparency that it creates. Now we've got a situation where we all get to see the bills. We should be able to see them on time, and we should have the opportunity now to comment, give feedback, and call things out we may not like or call things out that folks like. And so it's a good change. It's a positive change, and we at the Policy Center here are happy this has happened.
Yeah, so I mean, like you mentioned, Jason's had worked on that for many years, and it was adopted, I want to say, like 2 or 3 years ago by the Senate. But now that the House has also adopted it, they're pretty much out, which is great. So major good news there. I mean, it's just one of those things where you're just completely bypassing the rules in a sense. What's
Yeah,
the point of a cutoff if the cutoff doesn't matter, right?
right.
So
Yeah. The other thing, just as an inside baseball thing here, the Senate, you can strike an entire bill. It doesn't have to match the title. But in the House, the bill has to match the title, the content of the bill. So there's a couple of things there, some nuances there that really help. Now the House is doing this, you're not going to see any bills get completely struck with a what's called a replacement amendment or a full amendment there, to a striking amendment to replace it and replace the entire legislation as you do see in the Senate.
yeah, well, that's fantastic. I mean, it's just such a silly concept to begin with to think, like literal,
Right.
bull, throwing out the flag in front and then pulling it back, or a Charlie Brown football analogy, if you will. Okay, so let's talk about some of the legislation that is being proposed. And I don't know if we've talked on this year on the go, but you've put out good pieces on the return of rent control, which is obviously a bad bill. But now we also have another House bill here that you wrote about, 1334, that would have a similar effect in raising rents, raising housing prices. Which would allow municipalities to increase property taxes significantly. Talk to us about that. What's the motivation? What's the justification? And what are the actual impacts?
Yeah, well, so many years ago, if everyone recalls, there was an initiative that the voters passed that limited property tax increases to 1% per year for municipalities. And so a city couldn't increase its levy rate more than 1% per year. And the property taxes at the local level, it gets kind of get a little geeky, but it's based on the assessed value of the municipality. So if your city's worth 2 billion in property taxes, they set a levy rate, and then as the property values go up, the levy rate drops because they're not authorized to collect more than 2 billion in taxes. That's kind of why sometimes you see your taxes go down. That's what's causing that. Well, 1334 is an attempt by the legislature to circumvent that process. And so what they're saying basically now is we're going to change the inflationary calculation to CPI, which is a much more liberal interpretation of how much costs are going up. It's based on typical things in baskets rather than the overall cost of everything that we look at, which is what it's based on now on the GDP. So this gives them about a 2 to 3% extra ceiling on the calculation. And then on top of that, they're authorizing local municipalities to go from 1% to 3%. They already have something called bank capacity. So if a city decides that it doesn't want to raise its property taxes more than 1%, it can put that money aside for a future year, and maybe the next year it'll go 2%. But many cities haven't done that in the past. So you've got the situation where it put a restraint on the city, I think a good one, because it really made them think about how they're spending their money and not to let costs get too much out of control. Now, what the legislature is proposing is, first of all, we're going to change the inflationary calculation. And on top of that, we're going to let you get 3% per year. You could see tax increases of 5.5 property tax increases, 5.5 to 6% in total, depending on your council makeup. This is why local elections are so important, because those people are voting on those taxes. And that's at the local level. So larger cities, you're going to see a significant increase if that council decides it wants to increase this number more significantly. Then they're going to do it. And I've already spoken to some folks that have indicated that they're looking at this and they feel too constrained by the voters, which again, I think is a good thing.
It's just, I mean, when you kind of think about it in the abstract, the idea of being too constrained by the voters is such a funny concept to say, I'm really feeling too constrained to spend those people's money. I feel like they have a little bit too much say of how much I take from them. Just a wild concept. So when you're talking about this, the first thing that comes to my mind is, well, this will obviously make it harder for particularly younger people or people in lower income brackets to get to the step of being able to afford houses. Because, of course, one of the major components of your mortgage bill month to month is your property tax. And that's what's causing the mortgage to go up and up, assuming you don't have a variable interest rate. And so when you're thinking about what kind of a house you can afford, if you can, um, one of the things you have to consider is property taxes going up. So this just seems to me to be a direct barrier for housing, which Governor Ferguson, has said is one of his big goals, is to make affordable housing. So, what is there any like acknowledgement of this? Do you know if Ferguson has any opinions on this? I mean, what are the discussions in terms of housing affordability going on here?
Yeah, well, a local municipality, the percentage of the tax that they're increasing is a lower percentage compared to the state. But you're absolutely spot on. I mean, I think about my own property tax bill right now. It's almost twice what my initial rent was in my first apartment. Now, I'm a little older, so that may have been a while ago. But it just shows you how much things have gone up. I have three children. I have one that managed to get a house during COVID, and their property taxes are going up significantly, and it's now their property taxes are now higher than the interest on their mortgage, which is just crazy. And when they remove these they would call them limits or restrictions. I would say accountability. When they remove this accountability by having this, they're not forced to make the hard decisions about how do we deal with a budget shortfall. What do we prioritize on? And a local municipality should be focused on fixing the potholes, making sure we've got good utilities and services, police and fire, and the rest of that kind of stuff. And they don't. What happens is they, in the good years, they go spend large amounts of their operational budget on feel good things, arts centers. And I'm not saying arts centers are bad. I'm just saying for some municipalities, not a good idea. Why can't private industry help out with that? Or they'll build out large complexes. I think of my own city, and in our good years, our city manager at the time was proposing we tear down City Hall and another building that the city owned and remove a bunch of businesses and replace it with a $13 million new city hall. Now, the annual budget of our city is only 11 million. So, excuse me. So you see how ridiculous that is. Snohomish is going through the same thing right now. They've just done a compulsory purchase on a piece of land in town. They're building a huge city hall. Well, what's going to happen is all that cost has to be paid for by the citizens of that city. And so now with this 5.6% increase capability, they can just go back to the citizens and say, okay, we're just going to increase 5% because we have this new city hall that we absolutely needed. Incidentally, Mill Creek is still in the original building and it's just fine. And this is 10 years later. So you can see somebody has a good idea, they go spend the money, and now they want to increase the taxes. But if that tax capability wasn't there, if that accountability wasn't there, then you'd see a lot more of this. And that's what I'm afraid is going to happen here. A lot of municipalities are going to just start buying stuff because it's feel-good stuff. They should be focused on essential services.
Well, you're absolutely right. And to kind of the point you've been making earlier about this removing that accountability to make hard choices, um, it seems to me like when you're talking about cities and city councils and even the legislature writ large making decisions about what to spend on, there is sort of this idealistic vision that they should be able to invest in something like, let's say, a new building before it's too late, right? Like spending when it's going to be less expensive in the long term, right? Rather than having to, spend a bunch of money repairing a hole that filled and then also building a new building. So, there's sort of that optimistic vision. But when you remove that property tax limit, then it becomes easier and easier for that sort of preemptive, proactive, wise long-term investment thing to turn into pet projects like you described. Um, so I mean, is there any in the legislature? Is there any talk about the negatives of this? I mean, are there vocal opposition? Is there any dissent within the ranks of the party? I assume this is being brought up by the Democrats. Is there any dissent within the Democrat ranks that we know, or is this seemingly going to pass?
This has been attempted over the last few years in various different forms. I'm hoping the more moderate folks in the party, the more moderate representatives and senators will walk back from the cliff. Because once you open Pandora's box here, you're going to see significant property tax increases across the board because there are some municipalities who have, without restraint, grown their city. I can think of several cities in Snohomish County where they base their budget on unsustainable revenues, and now they're saying we can't afford our budget, somewhat like the state's doing. They're saying they've got this big deficit. That's not really the case. They just spent too much money. So a lot of these municipalities are in there, and they're starting to cut back on the essential services to fund some of these other things like DEI and some of these other initiatives that they've got, rather than focusing on what's essential. And that's what these cities do. So I'm hoping to see some cooler heads. I don't know. I have a feeling this might go. So, express your opinion to your legislators to make sure they understand the impact. And I'm hoping that it doesn't, because this is a good accountability measure for our local governments.
Yeah, and as a reminder, you can go to the legislature's website to testify on bills. You can do that written testimony. You can do it a live testimony in person or virtually, and you can even just express whether you support or oppose the bill. You don't even have to write anything if you don't want. So, if you want to do that, please make your voice heard. And I put the title or the number of the bill in the chat again. That's HB 1334. Um, Before we move on to the next topic, I just want to touch base. Is this being used as a in terms of the potential for rent increases? Is this being sort of saying, well, that's why we have is it what 5770 the rent limits bill, which obviously is going to then decrease housing, and you're just kind of shifting the burden. Are these being put in play with each other at all? The ostensibly rent control alongside this, or are they just kind of separate but happening to sort of have similar allies?
Yeah, they've definitely got similar allies. There's a cognitive disconnection between the limits they put in on rent, for example, in these rent control bills, which we're going to talk about, and the increases in property taxes. And most of the property in Washington State, the rental property in Washington State, is rented by individuals. It's not by large mega corporations. Well, there is a lot of that, obviously, but the majority is, hey, I was lucky enough to keep my first home. Maybe it was a small three-bedroom rambler or something like that, which now is considered a luxury mansion, but let's not go there. And you got yourself into a more a spacious house, and you were able to keep the first house, and then you rent that house out. Most of private rental properties like that, or somebody who invests into a duplex or something like that, and they live in one side and rent the other side. So we're not talking about these big corporations. So what happens is when you buy that, you're dependent on that mortgage or that rent to pay the mortgage that you may have remaining on that property. And as these property taxes increase, and I've seen in my own property a 300% increase since I moved in 20 years ago. So, that money, the only reason I would keep a rental property is if I'm gonna, first of all, I get the appreciation of the property, but I also have to cover the utilities, the replacement costs for carpet, paint, roof, the appliances in the house, and so on. I have to factor that into the rent. Plus, you have to assume it's going to be vacant for 10 to 20% of the time as tenants change over if you don't have a good tenant. Plus eviction costs and all that stuff. You factor that in, and then the state comes along and says, oh, by the way, you've got a 6% property tax increase. And oh, by the way, we forgot to tell you, you can't increase rent more than 3% without telling your tenant. And if you don't give them 180 days notice, they can sue you. And you're capped at 7% totally. So I know your property taxes went up 5.6%, but you're going to have to raise your rent at least 6 or 7% to cover that cost. What's going to happen here is people are going to turn around and they're going to sell those rental properties, and they're going to get sold to investment companies, maybe foreign, maybe US based, or they're going to be sold into the market at an increased price to offset the rental losses they made in the final few years on those properties. And what we're seeing right now, I think, is people that have had significant equity build up in those first homes and they were able to move into a second home, they're eating into that, not into the equity, but they're eating into that margin that it gave them on their mortgage payments, because the property taxes are now higher than their interest. They're higher than the principal in some cases as well. And that margin is coming down. And at some point, it's not profitable. Why would you rent a house if you're not going to make any money on it at all? There's just no reason to do it.
Well, and not to mention the massive risk of bad tenants, right? Because of all of those different protections that they have, again, you can say it's well intentioned, but the real effect is it lets bad actors get away with a lot, and that is another incentive for these small owners to sell, to not, because if you can't even evict in a reasonable manner, why would you take the risk? And if I recall correctly, the other aspect of that bill is that if you are notifying the tenant of an increase greater than 3%, they have the ability to terminate the lease within the 30 days without owing the rest. So this contract that you've signed for, let's say, a year is all of a sudden no longer void because of next year's contract, which is just a bonkers legal concept to me.
Yeah. Yeah, it puts a property owner in a very difficult situation, and it's just not worth the risk for many. They're not a corporation that owns 50, 60 apartments that can absorb some of that cost by averaging it out in the rent increases. If the state comes in and raises your property taxes 5%, 6%, then you might be looking at $500-600 increase or something ridiculous. And then what are you going to do? Just eat it? No, you're going to put it on the rent. And now you're in this situation where they cancel the contract and it all goes horribly wrong.
Well, and to your point, this is the exact thing that then encourages those big corporations that, again, the people who are proposing these policies are very skeptical of. And listen, I understand there are big corporations that and big companies and even small companies that can do bad things, but clearly the government is also doing a bad thing by then necessitating there be more of those actors, right? If your presumption is that big corporations are bad and can't be trusted with rents, well then gosh, we probably shouldn't enact laws that then create more of those entities, right?
Right.
Absolutely wild. And just as a personal anecdote, before my wife and I got married, I lived in a rented house with three other guys, and it was owned, just like you said, by someone who, I think this was maybe one of two properties that they owned that they rented or something like that. We had a great relationship. We were good tenants. We cleaned. We communicated with these people individually. They raised our rent by $50 each year. That's it. Because we were responsible, we were communicative, and they could trust us. But when you have these kinds of things built in, when you have tax increases or even limits to that, why would you take the risk and think, well, I can't increase this by more than X%, so I'm just going to have to max that out every time because we don't know if these people are still going to be good next year, still going to take advantage. It's just, it destroys the foothold for people to get up a rung in their living space in their life. That was a great deal for us four that lived together. If we didn't have that opportunity, we would have been much more worse off. So it's a real
Right.
shame to see this.
And there is resistance even in the legislators to even exempt like utilities or tax costs. So even if they said, okay, we're going to limit you to 7%, don't like the idea, but we're going to limit you to 7%, but we're not going to include the cost of taxes or some of these other, maybe some of the, what do you do if your roof fails? Then you have to
Right.
replace an entire roof. So but they don't want to even do that. So on one hand, they've got the government's beating you down with higher property taxes, and on the other hand, they're saying you can't raise your prices. So it's an incredibly damaging, probably one of the most, if not the most, piece of damaging legislation we've got this year that's going to hurt our housing market. And it will drive up costs of rental and house purchases, which is exactly what we don't need right now.
Well, and doing that creates homelessness, to be frank. And speaking of that, let's talk about the other bill which you wrote about, which again, it's one of those headlines that you read and you're kind of like, am I reading The Onion? Am I reading Babylon Bee? Is this actually the news? And unfortunately, it is, which is House Bill 1380, which would, as you write, allow homeless people to sue a city and collect taxpayer dollars. Talk to us about that. What is allow? Like, what are they suing over? What rights are we giving? And what is the big brain play here that I'm missing?
Right. Well, if you remember, there's this little city called Seattle that has had some homeless issues over the last few years. And a lot of the municipalities in the surrounding Puget Sound area have enacted homelessness statutes to keep themselves clean of, keep the homeless situation under control. So it doesn't end up like we did in Seattle. Marysville, Buren, in fact, last night or 2 nights ago, passed an ordinance, making it more restrictive on where the homeless can sleep. Now, my heart goes out I mean, we do need to figure out a way of dealing with the homelessness situation. There are many solutions. We're not going to cover those here. But in this particular case, Representative Mia Gregerson has introduced this bill, House Bill 1380, which will make it more difficult for a city to regulate its property. So you can imagine you've got a city park, and think smaller cities. Don't think big ones like Everett and Tacoma and Seattle and so and Spokane. But think about the smaller municipalities, the 25 to 40,000, the Mukilteos, the Edmonds, these types of cities, Moses Lake, where they're trying to keep maybe their parks clean from homeless folks and camps, and they just don't want it to be like it has been in Seattle. So they've passed ordinances that say, hey, you can't camp in our park, or in my city of Mill Creek, we have a panhandling ordinance, which has significantly helped, by the way. So other cities that may be listening might want to consider that. But a city may do that. Well, this particular bill says that you can't restrict the homeless unless you I'm going to read this to you here, objectively, reasonably, time, place, and manner regulations, pass regulations that are objectively reasonable as to time and place, and to manage public spaces effectively and preserve public peace, health, and safety that benefit the entire community. That includes warmth and sleep. There's more definitions in the actual legislation. What this effectively does is it says to a municipality, hey, if you restrict this too much, and the definition is so vague, you've opened all these doors, and you can pretty much guarantee who sponsored this bill if you're a trial lawyer. You've opened all these doors, and now I can sue the city because I wanted to sleep in the city park, and I wanted to be warm and I wanted to sleep here, but you told me I couldn't. Now I'm going to sue you for doing this, and it's a private right of action too. So the suit can be brought on behalf of somebody else. So a homeless person somebody can see a homeless person suffering, and they can bring the suit as a private action. So this is a horrendous bill, and ultimately what will happen is the city will probably end up settling out of court and paying some money, which both the prosecuting lawyer and the homeless person would benefit from. But you can quite easily see, as I was on John Curley yesterday, and he said, well, you're going to have $5,000 go away money. And that's probably what's going to happen with this bill, should it pass, is you'll end up with municipalities just giving money to homeless people to stop the lawsuits and settle out of court. Who's paying that bill? The taxpayers. How is the city going to recover that bill? It's going to increase your property taxes. That just exasperates the problem even further because they just drove up the cost of rental homes and houses.
Well, I've got a really great idea. What if cities just raised property taxes to help pay for this, so they could get the go away money right from the taxpayers, right?
Yeah, that's exactly what's going to happen, unfortunately. Now, what needs to happen is, there needs to be programs that help folks get out of homelessness and back into the community as productive folks. Not this. This does not help homelessness in any way whatsoever. All it does is it creates a fiscal liability for the municipalities, and this one should not be passed. It's an incredibly bad bill.
Well, that's exactly what I was thinking, is that even in sort of its best interpretation, this is a band-aid fix that does not address the homelessness situation. At best, you're merely helping alleviate a particular city's hostility to homelessness rather than providing the resources and tools to help the problem. And I think of people who'd want to choose this lifestyle. And that's the only justification that you could have for this is if you're saying, we recognize that these people want to be homeless and they want to have this lifestyle, and we're going to make it so that cities have to allow them in a whatever reasonable way to live their life there. But again, the problem with that then is the idea of public property, right? Just because it's public doesn't mean that everyone has equal right to it at the same times. Kind of the conundrum of public property. But to your to the point of solving homelessness, I think of models like there's a group called Network Tacoma. They're a nonprofit, and they have a model that works with incredible effectiveness, but they also have stipulations on that. And I think that, in order to get people out of homelessness, you have to have housing solutions that are able to be affordable and put them in a place that they're responsible for and take care of themselves. They also have to have incentive to work and to be productive and to get in, because there's oftentimes a drag on these people that's greater than just they couldn't afford rent. Sometimes that is the case, but oftentimes then you get into a deeper spiral and you need that almost sense of purpose. But the city doesn't want to address those things. And in fact, a lot of the I don't know, the problems that they seem to address are things like, well, we need to make sure they have safe access to needles, or we need to make sure that, again, in this case, they have safe access to the public park or whatever. Do you have any thoughts on why there's such an allergy to address the root causes here and always wanting to attack the peripheral parts of the problem?
I think about the city of Marysville, and Mayor John Nearing up there a few years back came in and said, look, if you're going to be homeless in Marysville, we're going to give you three options. Either you leave, you get into treatment, or you're going to go to jail. And that was extremely effective because for the folks that wanted that lifestyle, and there are some folks that do that, obviously, they just moved on. For the folks that said, you know what, I fell into this, I need to get out of this, I need help, whether that's mental health or physical health. There was an option there, and they partnered with nonprofits and so on. And then there was the third option of the belligerent who's just going to end up in jail. So, an incredible shift in what's going on. What I would say about 1380, though, this bill here, if all the money that this bill generated in the settlement had to go back to the city and was used to combat homelessness, to help folks get into treatment that wanted it, and none of it went to any of the prosecuting attorneys or the individual that sued, I can pretty much guarantee this bill would go away.
Well, maybe we should have an amendment for that kind of thing, and because that is kind of an interesting perspective on it, right? Because on the one hand, you do want people paid for their work, but you also, like you've said, create a frivolous lawsuit pipeline by this. And so if you almost made this out of a goodwill aspect, because there are, lawyers and people in the financial sector and the legal sector who will do cases pro bono for goodwill, for publicity, whatever, whatever motive you want to say, they'll do things for free. And this would be actually a great way to help maybe address the homelessness. But like you said, it's interesting that that's not a part of this bill here.
Yeah, this bill it should not go anywhere. It needs to go away.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for your time, Mark. Really appreciate it. Make
Yeah.
sure that you're following Mark's stuff on the blog. Again, busy legislative session, so I'm sure Mark's going to have a lot more writing ahead of him.
Thanks, Donald.
All right. Well, thank you for joining us this week. As a reminder, just a couple news items. We are suing Washington State. If you have not heard, last week we announced that we are working with Citizens Action Defense Fund to hold the Departments of Ecology and Commerce accountable. They are required to bring up-to-date emissions data for every 2 years at the end of an even numbered year. And at the end of 2024, they only provided us data through 2021. And so without this data, it's very difficult to have specifics on whether or not your policies are working. The data from 2021 show that our emissions are higher now than they were in 2012, in spite of the law requiring us to be at much greater percentages lower. In fact, we were, I think, 6% higher emissions in 2021 than the legal requirement was for 2020. At this rate, we have to reduce emissions by 2 COVIDs worth of emissions reductions in order to hit our 2030 metrics. Obviously, this is very unsustainable, but again, all of these policies, these climate policies that they want to put into effect to say that they're working, to say that we're a leader in climate, they're not providing us the data to know if they are. So far, it seems like the data indicates we're not, but we don't have the data that's required by law. So we are taking them to court to hold them accountable. Again, if a policy isn't working, we should at least know so that we can, worst case scenario, we're still getting taxed, but these tax dollars are being used effectively. One illustration that Todd likes to use is that, it'd be like paying when you're using money ineffectively, it's like you're paying hundreds of dollars for a latte. In fact, we have reports coming out tomorrow on that. So we're going to have a series called Report Card for Washington, where we're just bringing out how Washington is actually doing in all these different areas over the last decade or more to see, have we progressed? Have we come farther? What areas do we need work? What are we doing well in? So that's going to hit agriculture, it's going to hit education, going to hit business, all these kinds of sectors in Washington. So our lawsuit is kind of holding the legislators, or excuse me, not the legislators, the departments of ecology and commerce accountable to providing the data. And then everywhere else where we have data, we're going to be reporting on this. So keep an eye out tomorrow. We're starting with the electric vehicle subsidy program that was enacted last year. There's some very fascinating numbers about that you won't want to miss. And yeah, we're going to be doing these again weekly during the legislative session. So make sure to tune back for Washington Policy on the Go next week. If you're watching this on YouTube, again, like and share and subscribe. It helps us out a ton. Even just taking a moment to scroll down and click like helps boost the video in the algorithm for YouTube. So it really goes a long way. And we really appreciate all your support. Make sure to tune in next week, and we'll catch you then. Take care.